In a world that offered only chains and shadows, a child's silent cry echoed through the dust-choked plains. They had bound her to a fence, a brutal spectacle of an era's raw cruelty, leaving her to face the scorching sun and the chilling indifference of a forgotten settlement. But then, a silhouette emerged from the haze, a ghost of justice, a man whose past was as scarred as the land he walked, a freedman gunslinger, and he was about to give her more than just a home. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun beat down with the unforgiving wrath of a vengeful god, painting the parched earth in shades of rust and bone. It was an oven out here, the air thick with the smell of dry earth and something else, something acrid and bitter, like despair. Sarah, small and frail, a child barely old enough to know the contours of sorrow, hung from the rough-hewn timbers of the fence like a forgotten scarecrow. Her wrists, raw and chafed, were tied with thick rope, taut against the splintered wood. Her dress, once a pale blue, was now a grimy canvas of dirt and sweat. Her head, heavy with the weight of her suffering, was bowed, a stark silhouette against the blinding sky. Flies, relentless and buzzing, swarmed around her, their tiny forms a cruel mockery of the world's indifference. No one was near, not truly. The few scattered shacks and the distant skeletal outline of the general store offered no solace, only the silent judgment of a community that had seen too much and cared too little. This was punishment, they had said, for some perceived slight, some whisper of rebellion in a child's innocent heart. It was a common sight in these parts, a public display meant to break not just a spirit, but a lineage. The very air vibrated with the unspoken truth. This was a world designed to crush, to keep certain souls tethered to the ground, even after the chains had ostensibly been broken. The heat shimmered off the horizon, twisting the distant hills into mirages of hope that quickly dissipated, leaving only the stark reality of the present. Every breath Sarah took was a shallow gasp, a futile attempt to draw in air that felt too heavy, too full of pain. Her small body trembled with exhaustion, her skin already blistered, the sun's unyielding gaze etching its brand upon her. She was a testament to the quiet, insidious cruelty that festered beneath the surface of this supposedly new world. A shadow, long and lean, stretched across the cracked earth, preceding its owner with a quiet authority that defied the dust-choked wind. Elias Vance, the freedman gunslinger, emerged from the shimmering haze as if conjured from the land itself. His duster, worn but clean, moved with the measured grace of a predator, each step deliberate, unhurried, yet filled with an undeniable purpose. His eyes, dark and knowing, held the deep ancient weariness of a man who had seen the worst of humanity, and somehow, impossibly, still sought out its faint glimmer of something better. They swept over the scene, taking in the small, tied figure, the crude knot of the ropes, the grotesque theater of cruelty unfolding under the indifferent sky. He paused, his gaze lingering on the child's slumped form, a flicker of something raw and dangerous igniting deep within him. It was a familiar ache, an old wound reopened, the taste of injustice sharp on his tongue. The two men leaning against the ramshackle store porch, their faces etched with the harsh lines of prejudice and ignorance, watched him approach, their casual cruelty turning to wary suspicion. One, a man with a drooping mustache and a shotgun loosely held, shifted his weight, his eyes narrowed. "Lost, friend?" the man drawled, his voice thick with a thinly veiled threat. Elias stopped a few yards from the fence, the silence between them stretched taut, vibrating with unspoken challenges. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Sarah, then flickered to the men, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. He was a man of few words, his language spoken not with his tongue, but with the subtle tension in his shoulders, the unblinking intensity of his eyes. "She's tied," Elias finally stated, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection, yet carrying the weight of a thunderclap. It wasn't a question, but a declaration, a stark statement of an undeniable truth that shamed them all. The man with the shotgun, who went by the name of Silas, chuckled, a dry, grating sound that offered no humor. "Just teaching her a lesson is all. Lil' stray. Been causing trouble." The other man, thinner and shiftier, nodded, his eyes darting between Elias and Silas, seeking approval. Elias's gaze remained fixed on Silas, an unsettling stillness about him that felt more menacing than any shouted threat. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken challenge. Sarah, sensing the shift, stirred slightly, a whimper escaping her parched lips. It was a sound that cut through Elias like a poisoned blade, reaching a place within him that had long been hardened, long thought dead. The scars on his own back, unseen beneath his duster, seemed to burn with a phantom heat. He knew this punishment, the systematic breaking of spirit, the dehumanizing cruelty masquerading as discipline. He'd seen it, lived it, survived it. The rage that simmered beneath his calm exterior was a slow, deliberate burn, not an explosive blaze, but a deep, unyielding fire that consumed every shred of hesitation. "Untie her," Elias commanded, his voice still low, but now edged with a steel that made Silas flinch, despite himself. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with an authority that brooked no argument. Silas's brow furrowed, a mixture of surprise and wounded pride warring on his face. "Now see here, mister. This ain't your concern. This is our town, our rules." He tightened his grip on the shotgun, the gesture clumsy, almost desperate. Elias took a single, slow step forward. The world seemed to hold its breath. His hand, as if by instinct, drifted towards the worn leather grip of the revolver at his hip. The movement was barely perceptible, a whisper of intent, but its message was clear, chillingly so. The air thrummed with a dangerous energy, a silent promise of swift, inevitable consequence. The sun continued its relentless assault, the dust motes dancing in its harsh light, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath its gaze. The decision had been made, irrevocably. Silas swallowed, his bravado wilting under Elias's unwavering stare. He looked at the other man, a silent plea for support, but the shiftier one had already begun to slowly back away, sensing the unyielding force that stood before them. The silence stretched, unbearable, broken only by the buzzing of flies and Sarah's faint, ragged breathing. Finally, with a grunt of frustration and defeat, Silas lowered his shotgun. All right, damn it all," he muttered, resentment seeping into his voice, but the threat in Elias's eyes left him no choice. He walked grudgingly to the fence, his movement stiff with ill grace, and began fumbling with the knots that bound Sarah. His fingers, thick and clumsy, struggled with the tight ropes, each pull a reminder of his humiliation. Sarah whimpered again, her small body trembling as the first rope came loose, then the second. Her legs, weak and stiff from immobility, buckled as she was freed, and she crumpled to the dusty ground like a discarded rag doll. Elias was there in an instant, his movements fluid and swift. He knelt, his large hand gently supporting her small back, his other feeling for a pulse on her neck. Her skin was scorching hot, her breath shallow and uneven. He scooped her up, holding her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. Her head rested against his shoulder, a fragile bird seeking refuge. He could feel the rapid flutter of her heart against his ribs, a testament to her terror and exhaustion. He stood, turning his back on Silas and the retreating man, their petty cruelty fading into the background. The town itself seemed to exhale, a collective sigh of relief and unspoken judgment. He walked away from the fence, away from the dusty general store, away from the scene of her torment, his steps firm and resolute. Sarah made no sound, no protest, simply clung to him with a silent, desperate grip, her small hand clutching the fabric of his duster. The dust continued to swirl, kicked up by the harsh winds, a shroud drawn over the ugly memory, but the images of her suffering, the echoes of her quiet agony, were now seared into Elias's very soul. They were two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. The immediate aftermath was not relief, but a tense, unspoken race against time and retribution. Elias carried Sarah through the parched streets of the settlement, his eyes scanning every shadow, every open doorway. The few townspeople who had witnessed the scene either averted their gazes or watched with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, their silence a heavy shroud. No one dared to challenge him, but their stares were a palpable warning. He knew the kind of men Silas represented, men who nursed grudges like venomous snakes, who would not let a public humiliation go unpunished. Their pursuit, though not immediate, was a certainty. He reached his horse, a sturdy bay named Shadow, tethered near the livery. Its reins, secured to a weathered post, were unclipped with a practiced ease, his movements economical, precise. He settled Sarah gently across the saddle, her small frame almost lost against the broad leather. She was still mostly unresponsive, her eyes closed, her breathing still ragged. Her very stillness was a testament to the ordeal she had endured, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life in this unforgiving land. Elias mounted, his gaze sweeping the horizon one last time. The sun was a molten orb, beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to whisper of lurking dangers. He kicked Shadow into a trot, heading west, away from the oppressive settlement, towards the rugged, broken land that offered both concealment and peril. He felt the weight of Sarah's small body against his leg, a new, unexpected burden, yet one he bore without complaint. His past was a tapestry of solitary journeys, of living on the edge, always looking over his shoulder. Now he had another life clinging to him, another vulnerability to protect. The landscape stretched before them, an endless canvas of ochre and rust, punctuated by the skeletal forms of mesquite and the distant, formidable peaks of the mountains. He pushed Shadow, knowing that every mile gained was a moment of respite earned, a small victory against the looming threat. The wind picked up, a mournful whisper through the dry grasses, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and the unspoken promise of a harsh night ahead. The journey west was a blur of dust, sun, and silence. Elias rode with an almost relentless pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his ears attuned to every shift in the wind, every distant sound. Sarah remained largely quiet, her body limp against his, her small hands clutching his duster, a silent anchor in a world that had tried to cast her adrift. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of riding, sparse meals, and uneasy sleep under the vast, indifferent sky. As the brutal heat of day gave way to the cool, stark nights, Elias would meticulously tend to Sarah. He cleaned her wounds, gently applied salves he carried in his saddlebag, and forced small sips of water down her throat. Her body was a roadmap of bruises and scrapes, a testament to the casual brutality she had endured. He watched her sleep, her breathing shallow and vulnerable, and in those moments, the hardened shell around his own heart seemed to crack, just slightly. A fragmented image, sharp and sudden, pierced his thoughts. A young boy, no older than Sarah, his face streaked with tears and dirt, watching a fire consume something precious. The memory was fleeting, a ghost of a pain he had long buried, but it was enough to stir the deep waters of his own past. He closed his eyes against the vision, pushing it back into the shadowed corners of his mind. He wasn't just riding away from Silas and his ilk. He was riding away from all the Silases of the world, all the small-minded cruelties that chipped away at the soul, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. He had seen too much, done too much to be anything but weary. But this child, this small broken bird, stirred something within him that felt perilously close to hope. The landscape itself seemed to mirror their precarious existence, wide open, yet full of hidden crevices, dangerous beauty, and the promise of both sanctuary and oblivion. They were two lost souls navigating a world that offered them little more than hard ground and distant stars. Yet, in their shared silence, a fragile connection began to take root, like a stubborn seedling pushing through cracked earth, seeking the light. After what felt like an eternity, they found a temporary sanctuary in a small, forgotten valley, nestled within a fold of rugged, unremarkable hills. It was less a haven and more a secluded hollow, overlooked by the world, offering only the meager shelter of an overhang of rock and the sparse shade of a few gnarled junipers. Elias set about making it as habitable as possible, building a small, smokeless fire, gathering what little edible plants he recognized, and setting snares for small game. The stillness of the valley was a balm after the constant tension of the open road. Sarah, though still weak, began to stir, her eyes slowly losing their vacant, distant look. She would watch Elias with an unnerving intensity, her gaze following his every movement, a silent, watchful shadow. Her fear, though still palpable, was slowly morphing into a cautious curiosity. One evening, as the last sliver of sun painted the horizon in hues of bruised purple and gold, Elias offered her a piece of roasted rabbit. She hesitated, her small hand trembling slightly as she took it. Her fingers, still bearing the faint marks of the ropes, were delicate, almost translucent. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite, a stark contrast to the urgency of her body's hunger. It was a small act, but in the desolate landscape of their existence it felt monumental. Elias simply watched her, his expression unreadable, yet within him, a strange, unfamiliar warmth began to spread. He recalled the cold, hollow pit that had resided in his chest for so long, a legacy of battles fought and losses suffered. He had walked alone, choosing isolation as a shield against further pain. But this child, this fragile, resilient being, was chipping away at that shield, exposing a vulnerability he thought long dead. He said little, true to his nature, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed her how to collect water, how to identify safe berries, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. He taught her the quiet rhythm of survival, not with words, but with patient demonstration. A fragile, unspoken trust began to blossom between them, a delicate bloom in the harsh desert. The tension had receded, replaced by the rhythmic hum of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote, sounds that were now comforts rather than threats. The fragile peace of the valley was a fleeting comfort, a brief respite before the inevitable. One morning, as Elias was checking his snares, a shift in the air, a subtle disturbance in the natural rhythm of the wilderness, snagged his attention. A scent, faint but distinct, of unwashed horses and stale tobacco carried on the wind. Then the glint of sun-off metal in the distance, a flicker that was too deliberate, too unnatural to be anything but human. They had been found. Silas. The memory of the man's humiliated face, his venomous eyes, now solidified into a tangible threat. He had likely hired trackers, men who moved through the plains like shadows, driven by coin and malice. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, settled in Elias's gut. He walked back to their makeshift camp, his steps unhurried, yet every muscle coiled with a readiness for what was to come. Sarah, who had been sketching designs in the dirt with a stick, looked up, sensing the change in his demeanor. Her small face, no longer clouded by the constant fear of her past ordeal, held a new, quiet strength, a burgeoning awareness. "They're coming," Elias stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable weight. He didn't need to explain who they were. The unspoken threat had always hung over them, a storm cloud waiting to break. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve that surprised him. She was a child, yes, but tempered by hardship. The sight of her budding resilience brought a surge of protective fury within him, a dark, primal force he had long struggled to control. It also triggered a more profound, disorienting flashback. He saw a dusty, sun-baked street, the smell of burning wood, the shouts of men. His mother, her face etched with terror, her hands bound, dragged away by figures shrouded in darkness. Himself, a boy hidden in the shadows, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, unable to move, unable to save her. The crack of a whip, a distant, agonizing scream that echoed in his bones even now. That helplessness, that crushing failure had shaped him, forged him into the man he was. A man who carried a gun not for profit, but for a twisted sense of justice, a desperate need to reclaim a shred of agency from a world that had taken everything. This pursuit wasn't just about protecting Sarah. It was about confronting the ghosts of his own past, about silencing the screaming boy within him who had failed to act. The reality of the approaching threat settled over the valley like a heavy shroud. Elias knew he had two choices: flee again, endlessly running from the shadows of the past, or stand his ground. The memory of his mother's distant scream, the shame of his youthful helplessness, burned within him, a silent, insistent fire. He looked at Sarah, her small form radiating a quiet determination that belied her age. Her gaze, clear and unwavering, met his, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't run. Not anymore. This fight wasn't just for her future, it was for his own redemption. He began to meticulously prepare, his movements precise and unhurried, each action a silent prayer for strength. He checked his revolver, the familiar weight of the cold steel a reassuring presence in his hand. He loaded his rifle, the metallic click of each round a stark counterpoint to the quiet tension that filled the air. He showed Sarah the safest place to hide, a small crevice in the rocks, camouflaged by brush. "Stay there, no matter what," he instructed, his voice low, firm. "Don't come out until I tell you." She nodded, her eyes wide, but surprisingly devoid of tears. The training he'd unconsciously instilled in her, the lessons of quiet survival, had given her a stoicism beyond her years. He spoke few words, for what could words convey in the face of such a looming confrontation? His resolve was etched in the taut lines of his jaw, in the grim set of his mouth. This was not a fight he relished, but one he could not avoid. The men who pursued them were not just Silas and his thugs. They were the embodiment of an oppressive system, a lingering darkness that sought to reclaim its prey. He would not let them. Not this time. He moved to the edge of the small plateau overlooking the entrance to the valley, choosing his position with the strategic insight of a seasoned warrior. The sun was beginning its climb, casting long, stark shadows across the landscape, perfect for concealment. The air was still and cool, waiting. He could feel the pulse thrumming in his temples, a drumbeat to the impending conflict. This wasn't just a physical battle, it was a moral reckoning, a test of his own ambiguous code. He was a gunslinger, yes, but a freedman, a man who had tasted the bitter ashes of injustice. He would protect this child, not out of heroism, but out of a desperate need to right a single terrible wrong. The sun, now climbing high, bathed the valley in a harsh, unforgiving light as the riders appeared at the mouth of the pass. There were 5 of them, Silas and 4 crude, heavily armed men, their faces grim and determined. Their horses, weary from the chase, snorted and pawed the ground, kicking up clouds of dust. Silas spotted Elias first, standing on the rocky outcrop, a solitary, unmoving silhouette against the blinding sky. A guttural shout escaped Silas's lips, a mix of triumph and malice. "There he is, the N-word lover. Thought you could run, did ya?" His words, steeped in venom, echoed off the valley walls, a testament to the hatred that festered within him. Elias remained silent, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver. He watched them, his gaze unflinching, a predator calmly observing its prey. He wasn't a killer by nature, but he understood the language of violence, the stark arithmetic of survival. He had faced down worse men, worse odds. He waited, letting their bluster dissipate into the vastness of the land. Silas, emboldened by his numbers, drew his own pistol, its barrel glinting ominously. "Give us the girl, and maybe we let you ride on. Otherwise, this ends badly for you." Elias's voice, when it came, was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet. "She ain't going back." The words were simple, definitive, a line drawn in the sand that could not be uncrossed. A palpable tension settled over the scene, thick and suffocating. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. Silas barked a laugh, a harsh, humorless sound. "Fool, you're 1 man against 5. Elias's eyes, dark and ancient, held a quiet intensity that belied the apparent disparity in numbers. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected weight, "1 man is enough." He moved then, not reaching for his gun, but taking a calculated step forward, revealing a subtle shift in his stance, a barely perceptible tensing of his muscles. It was not an aggressive move, but a display of readiness, of an unyielding resolve that radiated outwards, unnerving the men. They had come expecting an easy victory, a simple capture, not a confrontation with a man who seemed to embody the very spirit of the wild, untamed land. The next few moments unfolded in a blur of swift, brutal efficiency. Elias didn't draw his weapon immediately, a calculated move designed to exploit their overconfidence. Instead, as Silas spurred his horse forward, yelling a command to his men, Elias dropped low, his body becoming a blur, seizing the lead horse's bridle, yanking it hard. The horse whinnied, rearing in protest, throwing Silas off balance. He tumbled from the saddle, landing in a heap of dust and curses. It was a simple, unexpected maneuver that shattered their formation and their complacency. As the other men hesitated, momentarily disoriented, Elias drew his revolver in a fluid, almost balletic motion. The first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the ground directly in front of the second rider's horse, kicking up a geyser of dust and rock. The horse shied violently, its rider struggling to maintain control, almost unseating himself. It was a warning, a display of skill rather than immediate lethal intent, but the message was clear. Elias was in control. The third man, a burly figure, panicked and fired wildly, his bullet whistling harmlessly into the sky. Elias's second shot was precise, aimed at the man's gun hand. A yelp of pain, and the pistol clattered to the ground, the man clutching his now useless hand. Two men remained mounted, their faces now etched with fear rather than bluster. Silas, scrambling to his feet, drew a derringer, his face contorted in a mask of rage. Elias turned to him, his revolver steady, pointing directly at the man's chest. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. "This ends here," Elias stated, his voice flat, devoid of mercy. "No more running, no more chasing." The weight of his own past, the echoes of his helplessness fueled his resolve. He wasn't seeking vengeance, but an end to the cycle of cruelty. He wasn't the law, but in that moment, he was the only justice these men would face. The choice was theirs, and it hung heavy in the silence, a profound and terrifying offer. Silas, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and terror, stared down the barrel of Elias's revolver. The remaining two men, seeing the cold, unyielding resolve in the gunslinger's eyes, slowly, reluctantly began to raise their hands. The fourth man, nursing his injured hand, was already slumped against his horse, defeated. The confrontation had been swift, brutal, and decisively in Elias's favor. It wasn't just the gun, it was the aura of contained power, the unshakable certainty that radiated from him. Silas, his bravado utterly shattered, let his derringer fall to the ground with a soft thud. He knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that he was utterly outmatched. The man before him was not just a gunslinger, he was a force of nature, forged in a crucible of suffering and injustice, and Silas was but a fly caught in his gaze. "Get out," Elias commanded, his voice a low growl, "and don't ever look back. If I see you again or hear of you bothering anyone like her, you'll wish you died here today." His words were a chilling promise, carrying the weight of a man who knew how to make good on such threats. Silas, humiliated and beaten, scrambled onto his horse, followed by his two remaining able-bodied men. They spurred their horses, riding off in a cloud of dust, their retreat a desperate, undignified scramble, leaving behind the injured man and the lingering scent of their malice. Elias watched them go, his expression still grim, but the tautness in his shoulders slowly began to ease. He then turned his attention to the injured man, who lay groaning on the ground. Elias disarmed him, then motioned for him to get on his horse. "Go with them," he said, his voice softer now, yet still firm. "Tell them what happened here. Let it be a lesson." The man, his face pale with pain and fear, nodded weakly and stumbled onto his horse, riding off to join his retreating comrades. The valley was silent once more, save for the distant hoofbeats of their flight and the gentle whisper of the wind through the juniper trees. Elias stood there for a long moment, the weight of the moment settling upon him. The fight was over, but the emotional toll lingered. He had faced his demons, both external and internal, and emerged victorious, but the victory felt hollow, tinged with the bitterness of the methods he was forced to employ. He wasn't a hero, but a survivor, a flawed man doing what he believed was right in a world that offered few clear paths. The silence that settled over the valley after the men departed was profound, heavy with the lingering scent of gunpowder and the residue of fear. Elias stood for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the now empty pass, ensuring no lingering threats. The tension that had held him rigid for days, for weeks, now slowly began to uncoil, leaving him feeling profoundly weary. The fight had been quick, brutal, a necessary evil, and it had left its mark not on his body but deep within his soul. He was not a man who found joy in violence, even when it was justified. The echoes of his own past, the memory of that helpless boy watching his world burn, still haunted the edges of his vision. He holstered his revolver, the familiar click a punctuation mark to the end of the immediate crisis. He walked towards the crevice where Sarah was hidden, his steps deliberate, the weight of the sun-baked earth beneath his boots a grounding sensation. When he reached the rocks, he knelt, his voice low and gentle, a stark contrast to the steel he had just exhibited. "Sarah," he called, "it's done, you can come out." A moment of silence, then a rustle from the shadows, and her small face appeared, streaked with dirt, her eyes wide, still holding the residual fear of the confrontation. But beneath the fear, there was also an undeniable glimmer of something else, a fierce, quiet relief, and perhaps a nascent understanding of the dangerous world they inhabited and the man who stood between her and its cruelty. She emerged slowly, her movements stiff, and then, without a word, she simply walked to him and wrapped her small arms around his leg, burying her face against his worn duster. Elias tensed for a moment, unaccustomed to such open displays of affection. Then, slowly, tentatively, he placed a large, calloused hand on her head, gently stroking her hair. It was an awkward, almost clumsy gesture for him, a man so long accustomed to solitude, but it was filled with an unspoken tenderness that transcended words. The battle had been won, not just against Silas, but against the specter of his own past, against the helplessness that had defined him. He had acted, he had protected, he had endured. He was still Elias Vance, the freedman gunslinger, a man of shadows and ambiguities. But in that quiet moment, with the small, trusting child clinging to him, he was something else, something more. He was a protector, a redeemer, a silent promise of a different future. The rising sun, no longer a harsh tormentor, painted the newly peaceful valley in hues of soft gold and rose. Its light, filtered through the sparse branches of the junipers, felt less like a judgment and more like a gentle embrace. Elias and Sarah sat by the still smoldering embers of their fire, sharing a meager breakfast, a quiet communion of two souls bound by shared ordeal and an unspoken understanding. The land stretched before them, vast and endless, no longer a relentless adversary, but a canvas of possibility. Elias looked at Sarah, truly looked at her, and saw not just the remnants of her suffering, but the burgeoning strength in her eyes, the quiet resilience in her small frame. The fear was still there, a shadow in the depths of her gaze, but it was now overshadowed by a fragile hope, a burgeoning trust. The question of where they would go next hung unspoken in the air, a vast open loop in their unfolding story. He was a man with no fixed address, no real home, only the road. But this child, this precious, hard-won life, deserved more than a life of constant flight. She deserved roots, a place where she could grow without fear, a place where the specter of the fence, and all it represented, could finally fade into a distant memory. He thought of the small, secluded homestead he'd heard whispers about, far to the north, nestled deep in the mountains, a place where folks of all colors sought peace away from the judging eyes of the settlements. It was a long journey, fraught with its own dangers, but it offered the promise of a true home, a sanctuary from the casual cruelties of the world. He was still a man of few words, but the silent promise in his heart was clearer than any spoken vow. He would lead her there, protect her, build a life that was hers, truly hers. The scars of their past would remain, etched into their very beings, but they would be reminders not of defeat, but of survival, of courage, of the enduring human spirit that refused to be broken. The road ahead was long, uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias Vance felt a flicker of genuine hope. The freedman gunslinger, a flawed and solitary man, had found his true purpose, not in vengeance or solitude, but in the quiet, profound act of giving a little black girl a home. Their story, steeped in the bitter soil of history, was not an ending, but a new, quiet beginning, unfolding under the boundless sky towards a future that, while still shadowed by the past, now held the promise of light.